The hum of my laptop filled the quiet of my dorm room, the soft glow of the screen casting long shadows across the walls. It was late, too late, really, and I should have been asleep. But sleep had been elusive lately, and the internet had become my refuge, a place where I could lose myself in the endless scroll of distractions. The weight of finals was pressing down on me, and the loneliness of the empty room only amplified the noise in my head. I scrolled aimlessly through social media, half-heartedly liking posts and skimming through updates from people I barely knew anymore. A notification pinged, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness. I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the name. Liam Carter. The name alone was enough to send a shiver down my spine. He wasn't just anyone. He was the Liam Carter, star quarterback, king of the social scene, and, for reasons I could never quite understand, my high school bully. Even now, years later, the sight of his name brought back a flood of memories I thought I'd buried. The way he'd smirked when he walked past me in the hallways, the way his laughter echoed in my ears long after the bell rang, the way he'd made me feel small, insignificant, like I didn't belong in his world. It wasn't the kind of bullying that left bruises or scars. No, Liam's cruelty was subtler, more insidious. The mocking smirks in the hallway, the whispered jokes that always seemed to find their way back to me, the way he'd look right through me like I was invisible. It wasn't physical, but it cut just as deep. And now, years later, here he was, popping up on my screen like a ghost from the past. I hesitated, my cursor hovering over the message. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to shut the laptop and pretend it hadn't happened. But curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. Hey, it's Liam. Long time no see. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Why was he reaching out? What did he want? Against my better judgment, I typed back, "Hey, yeah, it's been a while." The response came almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "How've you been?" I frowned, unsure how to answer. How had I been? It was a loaded question, one I wasn't sure I wanted to unpack with him. But something about the casual tone of his message put me at ease, and I found myself typing before I could overthink it. "I'm good. Just finishing up my degree." "You?" "Same," he replied. "Playing ball at state. Saw you online and thought I'd say hi." The conversation started awkwardly, stilted and unsure, but as the minutes ticked by, the words began to flow. He asked about my classes, my hobbies, my plans for the future. His tone was friendly, even warm, so different from the Liam I remembered. It was disorienting, like seeing a completely different side of someone I thought I knew. Curiosity morphed into intrigue as the days passed, and our conversations continued. He wasn't just the golden boy anymore. He was witty, intelligent, and surprisingly introspective. We talked about everything: our favorite movies, our most embarrassing moments, our deepest fears. Bit by bit, the walls between us crumbled, and I saw a side of him I never knew existed. One night, as we talked about our high school days, I couldn't help but bring up the elephant in the room. "Do you ever think about high school?" I typed, my fingers trembling slightly. There was a pause before he responded. "All the time. I wasn't the best version of myself back then." His honesty caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what I'd expected him to say, but it wasn't that. I hesitated before typing my next question. "Do you regret it?" This time, the pause was longer. I could almost feel him thinking on the other end of the screen. "Every day," he finally replied. "I was an idiot. I didn't know how to deal with my own crap, so I took it out on other people. You didn't deserve that." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent years replaying those moments in my head, wondering what I'd done to make him target me, why I hadn't been strong enough to stand up to him. And now, here he was, admitting that it had never been about me at all. "I didn't know," I typed, my vision blurring with tears. "I thought it was me." "It wasn't," he replied quickly. "It was never you. I was just messed up." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell him how much his words had hurt me, how they'd shaped the way I saw myself for years. But another part of me was afraid to reopen those old wounds, afraid of what it might mean to let him back into my life. Instead, I simply typed, "Thank you for saying that." Chapter 2. The Confession. One night, as our messages drifted into more personal territory, Liam admitted something that caught me off guard. "You know, I wasn't always fair to you," he typed. "I said things I shouldn't have. I was a jerk." I stared at the words, my chest tightening. It was the closest he'd ever come to apologizing. "Why?" I finally replied. "Why were you like that?" His response came slowly, each message a fragment of the truth. "I guess I was insecure. I had this image to keep up, and I thought putting others down made me look better. It was stupid. I'm sorry." I didn't know what to say. His honesty disarmed me, and against all odds, I found myself forgiving him. The conversation didn't end there. It stretched on for hours, peeling back layers of our past, revisiting old wounds I thought had healed but apparently hadn't. He told me about the pressure he'd been under. His father, a former college football star, had drilled into him the importance of being untouchable. Weakness was unacceptable, and somewhere along the way, proving his strength had meant making others feel small. He wanted me to be perfect, Liam typed, and when I wasn't, I felt like I was letting him down. So I took it out on everyone else. I told him how his words had shaped me, how I had carried them long after high school ended. The things he had said, the way he had treated me, it had lingered in the back of my mind every time I entered a new space, met new people. Would they see me the way he once had? Would I always be that invisible kid in the hallways, the one not worth noticing until it was time to be ridiculed? Liam apologized again, but this time it felt different. He wasn't just saying it because he thought he should. He meant it. "I wish I could go back and change things," he said. "I wish I could have been better to you." "You're different now," I replied. "That's what matters." As the weeks went on, our relationship deepened. It wasn't just messages anymore. It was video calls late into the night, stolen moments of laughter and connection. He'd become someone I could confide in, someone who understood me in a way few people did. We talked about our dreams, our fears, the things we were too afraid to tell anyone else. And with each conversation, I felt myself letting go of the past, of the hurt he'd caused me. Then, one night, after an especially long conversation, he hesitated before typing something new. "I think about you a lot, you know?" My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think about you. About us. About how things might have been different." My heart pounded. There was no way I was reading that right. Liam Carter, my former bully, was admitting that he had regrets? That he wished things had gone another way? "What are you saying?" I typed, my fingers shaking slightly. There was a long pause before his reply came through. "I don't know. I think I pushed you away because I didn't know how to deal with what I felt." A lump formed in my throat. I had spent years convincing myself that Liam had only ever seen me as a target, someone to make him feel bigger, stronger. And now he was telling me that he had felt something else entirely? I wanted to ask more, to press him for details, but I was afraid of what he might say, afraid of what it might mean. Instead, I simply replied, "I don't know what to say to that." His next message came quickly. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." That night, I lay awake long after our conversation had ended, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced through memories of high school, through the quiet moments when Liam's eyes had lingered on me a little too long, the times when his teasing had felt almost pointed. Had I misread everything? Or had I been right all along to think that there had always been something unspoken between us? Either way, there was no turning back now. It started like any other conversation. We were talking about our favorite childhood memories, the light banter that had become the foundation of our recent interactions. I had come to look forward to these quiet exchanges, these moments when the past seemed distant and the awkward tension between us was a memory. Liam had morphed into someone I enjoyed talking to, someone who didn't make me feel small or insignificant, but understood me in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I felt seen. But then, out of nowhere, he sent a picture. Not just any picture, a naked picture. The screen on my laptop froze for a moment as my eyes locked onto the image. My pulse quickened, a mixture of shock, curiosity, and dread swirling inside me. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. The image wasn't explicit in a crude way, but there was no mistaking it. It was intimate, personal, a silent demand for acknowledgement. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. The small part of my brain that could still form coherent thoughts screamed at me to look away, to close the laptop, shut everything down, and forget this ever happened. But the rest of me, the part that had grown used to the intoxicating connection we'd shared, didn't want to look away. I couldn't. My eyes were drawn to it, to him, as if the image had a pull that I couldn't resist. I felt my heart race as I typed, my fingers trembling over the keyboard. "What are you doing?" It was a half-hearted attempt at regaining control. I wasn't sure if I wanted to confront him, demand an explanation, or just shut the conversation down entirely. But the message I received in return was maddeningly casual, almost as though he hadn't sent me anything that would send my entire world tilting off its axis. "Just wanted to show you," he replied. His response, so flippant, left me feeling exposed. But it was the next message that really sent my mind spiraling. "You like it?" The question hung in the air between us like a thread, one that I knew I could either pull on or sever entirely. I was already in too deep, I realized. Something in me had shifted, crossed over a line, and once that line was crossed, there was no going back. I hesitated, biting my lip as I stared at the photo again, my pulse racing. I could feel the heat of my face, my heart thudding in my chest as 1,000 thoughts tumbled over one another. This wasn't just some random person I had met online. This was Liam, the boy who had taunted me for years, the boy who had made me question my worth. And now, he was asking me to look at him in a way I hadn't been prepared for. But the strange thing was, he wasn't the same Liam anymore. This new Liam, the one who sent messages about the movies we loved or the things that scared us, had changed something inside me. I was no longer that awkward, uncertain teenager he used to tease. I wasn't sure what to make of this, but I wasn't angry, not the way I used to be. Instead, I felt something else, something that tangled my thoughts and emotions into a mess of longing and confusion. "Yeah, I guess," I typed, the words feeling foreign as they left my fingers. It wasn't a resounding affirmation. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough. It was enough to tell him that I was still there, still engaging with him, even if I wasn't entirely sure why. The conversation shifted after that. It wasn't just the usual texts and lighthearted banter. Suddenly, there were more intimate questions, more flirty remarks. He sent me more pictures, some more revealing than others, each one feeling like another layer peeled back, each one making it harder to discern where the lines of friendship, attraction, and something darker began and ended. I started to question myself. Why was I still here? Why was I even entertaining this? Was I so desperate for attention that I would accept it from the same person who had made my high school years miserable? But the truth was, it wasn't just about the pictures. It was about the person behind them. The way Liam had become someone I could talk to, someone who listened when I opened up about my life, my dreams, my fears. And though I hated to admit it, there was a part of me, maybe more than a part, that wanted this. Wanted him. Wanted whatever this was. I kept going back to the idea that I didn't really know Liam anymore. This was a new version of him, one that wasn't tainted by the years of bullying, one that wasn't confined to the high school halls. But was I really fooling myself? Was this Liam simply another mask he wore to gain my trust, to pull me closer? Or had he changed? And if he had changed, what did that mean for me? The truth was, I was scared. Scared of what this meant. Scared of the growing attraction that stirred within me. The way my chest tightened whenever he sent a message or called. The way my thoughts always seemed to circle back to him. It felt like a drug. And I knew, deep down, I was getting addicted. We continued to exchange pictures, each one a silent invitation to step further into the murky waters of whatever this was. There were no clear boundaries anymore. No rules. Just the two of us, navigating a landscape where nothing made sense, but everything felt dangerously exciting. I remember the first time he asked to video call me again after that night. His face was soft on the screen, his eyes warm, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It was a stark contrast to the boy I had known in high school, the arrogant, untouchable version who would have never allowed himself to be vulnerable, to let someone see him as a person, not a legend. I still didn't know what this meant, what we were doing, but as I stared at the screen, at the man who was now more than a memory, more than the boy who had taunted me from across the classroom, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something new, or if it was a mistake waiting to happen. I couldn't say I didn't enjoy the attention. I couldn't say I didn't crave it, even though I knew how dangerous it was. There was a part of me that wanted to pull away, to demand that we stop, to retreat into the safety of old patterns. But another part, a much larger part, was excited by the uncertainty, the thrill, the unknown. And so, I stayed. I responded to his messages. I sent him pictures of my own, my heart pounding with each one, as though the very act of sharing something so personal could unravel everything I had carefully built up until then. But deep down, I knew. This was a line we couldn't uncross. And once it had been crossed, there would be no going back. Chapter 4. The Meeting. Late one night, after yet another message, Liam asked to meet in person. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a vague, maybe we should hang out sometime. It was a demand, soft but persistent. A request so direct, it sent a jolt of electricity through my chest. Are you sure? I asked, my anxiety creeping in. I had never felt more vulnerable, more unsure. There was something about meeting face to face that terrified me. The idea of seeing Liam in real life, after months of conversations through screens, felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff, knowing there would be no way to stop myself from falling. I want to see you, he replied, not through a screen. Just us. No distractions. It was a simple message, but the weight of it hung in the air. Just us. There was no hiding behind text, no safe distance. Just him. Just me. All the things we'd shared online, all the things we hadn't said yet, would suddenly be exposed in the flesh. My hands shook as I read his words. I had already crossed so many boundaries with him, already shared parts of myself I never thought I would. But this was different. This wasn't a private exchange between two people in the safety of their own spaces. This was real. This was happening. Where? I typed after a long pause. When? Tonight, he responded, and I could practically hear the impatience in his words. I'll be at the park, the one by the lake. I'll be waiting. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was enough. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, my thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room and pretend none of this was happening. But another part of me, perhaps the one that had been slowly unraveling with each conversation, each shared secret, couldn't pull away. I wanted to see him just as badly as he wanted to see me. I told myself I was being stupid, that this was reckless. that I was setting myself up for something I wouldn't be able to walk away from. But my fingers moved before I could stop them, and I found myself typing back, "Okay, I'll be there in 20. I didn't know why I agreed. I didn't know what was waiting for me, or what I was even hoping to find. But I couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that was drawing me toward him, toward whatever this was between us. The unknown. The drive to the park felt like an eternity, even though it was only a few miles away. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I was making a mistake, if this was really something I wanted, or if I was simply chasing a fantasy that would disappear the moment I saw him in the flesh. When I arrived, the park was eerily quiet. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking softly, like they were whispering secrets to each other. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, its surface reflecting the starry sky above. It was beautiful, serene, but it felt wrong. Like I didn't belong here, like I was intruding on a world I wasn't meant to be a part of. And then I saw him. He was standing near the edge of the lake, his figure illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. Liam, the boy who had tormented me for years. The boy who had made me feel invisible, small, unworthy. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me, a stranger and a familiar face all at once. He looked different. His hair was shorter than I remembered, but still messy in that effortlessly cool way. His broad shoulders filled out the faded jacket he wore, the fabric stretched tight against his chest. His eyes, though, they were the same eyes I remembered, intense and almost too knowing. They met mine as soon as I stepped into view, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything that was about to happen. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My heart was pounding, every beat echoing in my ears. I took a hesitant step toward him, my feet feeling like they were made of lead. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding too small in the vastness of the night. I immediately regretted it, the word feeling weak and out of place. Liam's lips curved into a smile, the kind of smile that made my stomach flip. It was different than the smirks I remembered. It was warm, inviting, genuine. For a second, I forgot about everything else. I forgot about the bullying, the past, the fear. It was just him and me in this moment, and that felt dangerous. "Hey," he replied, his voice low and steady. He took a step toward me, and suddenly the distance between us felt smaller, more intimate. The air between us buzzed with a charged energy I couldn't quite explain. "I wasn't sure you'd show," he added, his eyes scanning my face as though searching for something. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I hadn't really expected to be here, not really. And now that I wasn't sure what to say. The weight of everything, our past, our conversations, the tension that had been building between us, settled on me like a heavy cloak. "I almost didn't," I said, finally finding my voice. "But here I am." He stepped closer, the warmth of his body radiating toward me, and I could feel the heat of my face flush. The space between us was shrinking, and I wasn't sure if I should pull back or lean in. "I'm glad you did," he said quietly, his hand brushing against mine. It was a fleeting touch, almost like an accident, but it sent a shiver down my spine. His touch was electric, igniting something in me I didn't know was there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, looking at each other, feeling the weight of the moment. The quiet of the park wrapped around us, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a countdown, like something was about to happen, something we couldn't stop. And then, as if some unspoken agreement passed between us, Liam reached up and gently cupped my face with his hand. The touch was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into it, feeling the roughness of his skin against mine, the warmth that spread through me with every second. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though he were afraid of the answer. I nodded before I could stop myself. I didn't think about it. I didn't question it. I just knew, in that moment, that this was what I wanted. The first kiss was tentative, unsure. Our lips met softly, brushing together like two strangers trying to figure out if they belonged in each other's space. But then, slowly, we both leaned in, deepening the kiss. The world around us seemed to vanish, the sound of the night fading into the background. There was only him, only the way his lips fit against mine, the way his hand moved from my face to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. It was everything and nothing at the same time. The kiss felt like a beginning, but also like an ending. It was the start of something new, something that would inevitably change both of us. And yet, it was an answer to every question I had been asking in my mind. An answer I hadn't known I needed until that very moment. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, Liam looked at me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. His eyes were darker now, filled with something I couldn't quite name. There was no going back now. I knew that. "Are you okay?" he asked, his thumb brushing over my bottom lip as if he were memorizing the feel of me. I nodded, though the words caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what was happening, but in that moment, I didn't need to know. I just needed to feel it. "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm okay." One night, after a particularly intense encounter, I voiced my fears to Liam. The emotional toll was weighing heavily on me, and despite the thrilling, heady moments we'd shared, the fear of what was to come gnawed at the edges of my mind. "What if someone finds out?" I asked, my voice trembling. I hadn't meant to sound so fragile, but it was out there now, vulnerable, hanging between us. He sighed deeply and pulled me closer to him, his hands warm on my skin. He didn't answer immediately, as if he were weighing the consequences of his words. We were standing in the park again, but this time, the moon didn't offer the same comfort it had the first night. The air between us had shifted, as if the weight of our secret was finally catching up with us. "We'll deal with it together," he said finally, his voice steady, but there was a tightness there that hadn't been there before. The calmness in his words was supposed to reassure me, but somehow it had the opposite effect. It made the danger of what we were doing feel all the more real. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I nodded, a heavy sense of foreboding settled deep in my stomach. The truth had a way of making its presence known, no matter how hard you tried to bury it. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. Every time I glanced at my phone, I wondered if today would be the day someone uncovered our secret. I found myself scanning the faces of everyone around me, looking for signs of suspicion, for the whispers that would inevitably follow when people found out. It wasn't that I cared what they thought. It was that I feared the consequences. Our connection had already been dangerous from the start, but the idea of others finding out, that was a different level of risk. Liam seemed more distant in the days that followed, more preoccupied. It was as if the weight of our secret was pushing him into himself, and I couldn't blame him. I felt it too. The pressure was building, the walls closing in, and soon, one way or another, it would all come tumbling down. And then, one fateful morning, it did. It started with a text message, a simple notification that buzzed on my phone. I almost didn't want to open it, but my curiosity won out, and I unlocked the screen to see a message from an unknown number. "I saw you with Liam." My heart stopped. The words were innocuous enough, but the implication was clear. Someone had seen us. Someone knew. I stared at the screen, my thoughts scattering. I could feel the panic rising, my chest tightening as my mind raced. Who could it have been? How much had they seen? How much had they understood? The message continued. "If you don't want the whole school to know, I suggest you stop meeting him." A sick feeling spread through me. The message was a threat, but it wasn't just a threat to me. It was a threat to everything Liam and I had built, to everything we had come to mean to each other in the secrecy of our stolen moments. It was a warning, one I wasn't sure how to respond to. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to hope it would all go away. But the voice inside my head, the one that had been growing louder with each passing day, told me that this was only the beginning. This was the first crack in the facade, and it would only get worse from here. I needed to talk to Liam. When I found him later that day, he looked even more distant than before. There was an edge to his smile when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze was clouded with something darker, something I couldn't quite place. But as soon as I spoke, all the tension in his face dissolved. "Hey," I said, my voice quiet, hesitant. He looked at me, his brow furrowing. "Hey, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I didn't know how to say it, how to tell him what had happened, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. "I got a message," I said. "Someone saw us. They said they would tell everyone if we keep meeting." Liam's face went pale. For the first time in all our time together, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Who was it?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "I don't know. An unknown number," I said, feeling the sting of my own words. "But they know. They know everything." Liam cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated fear. I could see the wheels turning in his head, but the solution wasn't coming fast enough. "We can't let them win," he said after a long silence. "We just need to lay low for a bit. No one can know." But I didn't feel reassured. His words sounded empty, hollow, like he was trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince me. The truth was, we were already too deep in. We were already exposed, and I could feel the cracks forming in our fragile little world. The days that followed were a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. The air around me felt thicker, suffocating, as if everyone knew but no one was saying anything. I couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't focus on anything but the nagging feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't long before the rumors began to spread. At first, it was subtle, just a few hushed conversations in the hallways, a glance here and there. But the whispers grew louder, the stares more obvious. I couldn't walk through the cafeteria without feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me, and I couldn't even look at Liam without seeing the judgment in the eyes of others. The weight of their expectations, their disgust, was palpable. And then, one day, as I sat alone in the library, trying to drown out the chaos around me, I heard my name. "Isn't that the guy who's sleeping with Liam Carter?" someone whispered, loud enough for me to hear. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My face burned with shame, and I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the shadows. But there was no hiding now. The truth was out, and it was uglier than I had ever imagined. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on my work, to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The world had shifted beneath me, and I was no longer the same person I had been just a week ago. The worst part was seeing how it affected Liam. He had always been the golden boy, the one everyone admired, the one who could do no wrong. But now, he was a pariah. His friends abandoned him, his teammates distanced themselves. And as for me, well, the bullying began in earnest. The snide comments, the sneers, the way people looked at me like I was something disgusting. But the worst of it all came when Liam's coach called him into his office. The rumors had gotten back to the team, and the pressure was building. The scandal was too big to ignore. That afternoon, Liam and I met in the park again, our safe haven. But this time, there was no comfort in the shadows, no peace in the silence. "I have to quit," he said, his voice rough. The coach says I can't keep playing ball if this gets any worse. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Liam Carter, the star quarterback, the golden boy, was giving up everything. For me. And I couldn't even look him in the eye. You can't, I said, my voice cracking. You don't have to do that. You can't throw away everything because of me. But Liam shook his head, his eyes hard with resolve. I've already lost everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm not losing you. It wasn't the reassurance I wanted. It wasn't the easy answer that would fix everything. But it was the truth. And the truth was that we were both trapped in this mess, and the consequences of our actions had only just begun to unfold. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Years later, I often think back to that time in my life. It was a whirlwind of emotions, a dangerous obsession that shaped me in ways I couldn't have imagined. In some ways, I'd like to believe that I've moved on, that I'm different now, stronger. But in many other ways, I know that part of me will always carry the weight of what happened. That time with Liam wasn't just some fleeting memory. It was a seismic shift. We were both so young, so full of hope and raw emotion. There's something deeply vulnerable about first love, something that makes you believe that the intensity of your connection is all-encompassing and eternal. But when the dust settles, when the world shifts around you, it's hard to know where you stand anymore. The person you were, the person you thought you knew, isn't quite the same after you've been through something like that. I've learned that there's a kind of power in surviving the fallout. You don't realize it at the time, but you're being forged in the fire. I used to think that the pain of losing something, of losing him, was the end, but it wasn't. It was the beginning. The hardest part wasn't the fallout itself, though. No, it was the silence after the storm. The loneliness that crept in once the rumors had faded, once the judgment had begun to wear off. It was the years that followed, quiet, full of introspection, where I had to face who I was without the crutch of that forbidden connection. I often wondered if I was still the same person who had once allowed my heart to burn so brightly for someone like Liam. Had I changed? Had I grown? Or was I just an echo of that version of myself, constantly chasing the high of something I could never fully have? I remember the first time I ran into Liam after it all fell apart. It was unexpected. One of those random moments when the past comes rushing back, uninvited. I was walking down the street, my thoughts drifting to the mundane when I saw him. There he was, standing in front of a coffee shop, looking like no time had passed at all. He was different, but not in the way I expected. He was older, of course, but it was more than that. He had that same confident smile, the one that used to make me feel like the world was his to conquer. But there was a depth in his eyes now, a quietness that spoke of everything he'd lost. He was still the golden boy, but the shine had dulled, and I could see the scars, the weariness beneath the surface. "Hey," he said, his voice warm, though there was a hesitation in it now that hadn't been there before. "It's been a long time." I stood there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. It had been years since we'd spoken, since we'd seen each other. So much had happened between us, so many things left unsaid. "Yeah," I finally said.
"It has."
The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with all the unspoken words between us. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something, and yet neither of us knew what to say next. We had both been through so much since we last saw each other. Different lives, different paths, and yet in that moment, it was as if time had folded back on itself, and we were right where we started. And then, one day, as I sat alone in the library, trying to drown out the chaos around me, I heard my name. "Isn't that the guy who's sleeping with Liam Carter?" someone whispered, loud enough for me to hear. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My face burned with shame, and I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the shadows. But there was no hiding now. The truth was out, and it was uglier than I had ever imagined. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on my work, to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The world had shifted beneath me, and I was no longer the same person I had been just a week ago. The worst part was seeing how it affected Liam. He had always been the golden boy, the one everyone admired, the one who could do no wrong. But now, he was a pariah. His friends abandoned him, his teammates distanced themselves. And as for me, well, the bullying began in earnest. The snide comments, the sneers, the way people looked at me like I was something disgusting. But the worst of it all came when Liam's coach called him into his office. The rumors had gotten back to the team, and the pressure was building. The scandal was too big to ignore. That afternoon, Liam and I met in the park again, our safe haven. But this time, there was no comfort in the shadows, no peace in the silence. "I have to quit," he said, his voice rough. "The coach says I can't keep playing ball if this gets any worse." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Liam Carter, the star quarterback, the golden boy, was giving up everything. For me. And I couldn't even look him in the eye. "You can't," I said, my voice cracking. "You don't have to do that. You can't throw away everything because of me." But Liam shook his head, his eyes hard with resolve. "I've already lost everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not losing you." It wasn't the reassurance I wanted. It wasn't the easy answer that would fix everything. But it was the truth. And the truth was that we were both trapped in this mess, and the consequences of our actions had only just begun to unfold. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Years later, I often think back to that time in my life. It was a whirlwind of emotions, a dangerous obsession that shaped me in ways I couldn't have imagined. In some ways, I'd like to believe that I've moved on, that I'm different now, stronger. But in many other ways, I know that part of me will always carry the weight of what happened. That time with Liam wasn't just some fleeting memory. It was a seismic shift. We were both so young, so full of hope and raw emotion. There's something deeply vulnerable about first love, something that makes you believe that the intensity of your connection is all-encompassing and eternal. But when the dust settles, when the world shifts around you, it's hard to know where you stand anymore. The person you were, the person you thought you knew, isn't quite the same after you've been through something like that. I've learned that there's a kind of power in surviving the fallout. You don't realize it at the time, but you're being forged in the fire. I used to think that the pain of losing something, of losing him, was the end, but it wasn't. It was the beginning. The hardest part wasn't the fallout itself, though. No, it was the silence after the storm. The loneliness that crept in once the rumors had faded, once the judgment had begun to wear off. It was the years that followed, quiet, full of introspection, where I had to face who I was without the crutch of that forbidden connection. I often wondered if I was still the same person who had once allowed my heart to burn so brightly for someone like Liam. Had I changed? Had I grown? Or was I just an echo of that version of myself, constantly chasing the high of something I could never fully have? I remember the first time I ran into Liam after it all fell apart. It was unexpected. One of those random moments when the past comes rushing back, uninvited. I was walking down the street, my thoughts drifting to the mundane when I saw him. There he was, standing in front of a coffee shop, looking like no time had passed at all. He was different, but not in the way I expected. He was older, of course, but it was more than that. He had that same confident smile, the one that used to make me feel like the world was his to conquer. But there was a depth in his eyes now, a quietness that spoke of everything he'd lost. He was still the golden boy, but the shine had dulled, and I could see the scars, the weariness beneath the surface. "Hey," he said, his voice warm, though there was a hesitation in it now that hadn't been there before. "It's been a long time." I stood there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. It had been years since we'd spoken, since we'd seen each other. So much had happened between us, so many things left unsaid. "Yeah," I finally said.
It has.
The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with all the unspoken words between us. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something, and yet neither of us knew what to say next. We had both been through so much since we last saw each other. Different lives, different paths, and yet in that moment, it was as if time had folded back on itself, and we were right where we started.